Hey, welcome to Psychology with me. My name is Rashad, and today we'll be continuing in the book Exploring Social Psychology. Last time we had Module 1, which was Doing Social Psychology. Today we're going into Module 2, Did You Know It All Along? All right, so one of the things that the module starts off with is saying things like every day people observe, interpret, and influence others' actions. So, it should not surprise us that many of the book's conclusions we already know. Basically trying to say that social psychology simply formalizes what most people already know. Once people actually go out and do the studies, then we find out there's something that we already kind of intuitively understood already. So there are people that felt both ways about this, but let's start with the hate. There was a writer called Cullen Murphy in 1990. He was quoted by saying, "Day after day, social scientists go out into the world, and day after day they discover that people's behavior is pretty much what you'd expect." Now, this isn't a new critique. If you go back even 50 years before that, you'll see that historians reacted in a similar way, scorning social scientists, even as it pertained particularly with studies of American World War II soldiers. So what I'm about to do is I'm about to read you 4 examples of the observations, but then also the commentary that went with those observations. And then I want you to see what you think about it, and we'll get an assessment from there. All right, so number 1. Number 1 said, talking about American World War II soldiers, that better educated soldiers adjusted less easily than did educated soldiers. It says that intellectuals were less prepared for battle stresses than were street smart people. That makes sense. Number 2, Southern soldiers coped better with the hot sea island climate than did Northern soldiers. The thought was that Southerners are more accustomed to hot weather. That makes sense. All right, so the third finding is that white low-ranking soldiers were more eager for promotion than were black low-ranking soldiers. The rationale for that was that years of oppression to the black community that had taken a toll on the achievement and motivation. And to a certain extent, I can see that. So when you talk about people somewhat losing hope as far as them having a chance to actually succeed or believing that it's actually possible, I can see that. I can see that a little bit. Number 4. All right, so number 4 says, Southern blacks preferred Southern to Northern white officers. Let me read it better than what it was written. It says, Southern black soldiers preferred Southern officers over Northern white officers. The rationale behind that is Southern officers were more experienced and skilled in interacting with blacks. That part, I don't believe at all. So, but we'll actually read on. Basically, it all sounded like common sense, right? Except for maybe that last one. That last one I wasn't really feeling. But anyway, the truth is that every one of those statements are the complete opposite of what they actually found. So for number one, where it says that better educated soldiers adjust less easily than did less educated soldiers, the truth is that the less educated soldier adapted more poorly. So the less educated soldiers had the tougher time. The people who we thought were more street smart were the people who struggled the most through this observational assessment. Number 2 said that Southern soldiers coped better with hot climates, basically, better than the Northern soldiers. What ends up happening is that Southerners were not more likely than Northerners to adjust to tropical climates. So it wasn't really a distinguishing factor. I wouldn't have guessed that. All right, so number 3. Number 3 says, white low-ranking soldiers were more eager for promotion than were black low-ranking soldiers. And that one I was kind of on the fence on, if you remember. What it actually says is that blacks were more eager than whites for promotion. Maybe it was them seeing this as an opportunity to finally ascend in some sort of rank. Maybe the mindset was more to jump on it rather than to stay in a certain caste or place in society. So it was found that if it actually didn't give it an example for number 4, and I understand why, because that seemed totally off anyway. It found that if the actual results were mentioned earlier, we would have likely labeled those as obvious also. So are the results that what I just told you were mentioned earlier, then most likely that would have been obvious to you, just like it may have seemed obvious to you with the first set of results. Now, one problem with common sense, they say in this book, is that we invoke it after we know the facts. Events are far more obvious and predictable in hindsight than beforehand. So when people learn the outcomes of an experiment, that outcome suddenly seems unsurprising or much less surprising than those unaware to the outcome. And when you really look at it, you kind of see it in everyday life, where something happens and then people get the results of it, and we kind of retroact our knowledge and knowledge base, and oh yeah, well that makes sense because of this, that, and the other. We'll even give reasons. I'll give reasons. So oh yeah, that makes sense because da 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 da. So I know I'm guilty of it, and this is basically a common thing. So this tendency to retrofit our prior expectations is the main basis of this module number 2. So this tendency to retrofit our prior expectations is called hindsight bias, or the I knew it all along phenomenon. Now, in definition form, hindsight bias is the tendency to exaggerate after learning an outcome. One's ability to have foreseen how something turned out. Hindsight bias is the tendency to exaggerate after learning an outcome. One's ability to have foreseen how something turned out. Now, hindsight bias has become one of psychology's best established phenomena. Likewise, in everyday life, we often do not expect something to happen until it does. Then we suddenly see it clearly, the forces that brought the events about, and feel unsurprised. Now, what's crazy about this is that it also goes on to say that we may also misremember our earlier view. So even if we've come out and said something earlier about our position on a certain thing, hindsight bias can have us misremember, while we'll misremember through hindsight bias what we actually said initially, catering it towards what we now know is the answer or the solution. And again, you see this in conversations everywhere. You'll probably start noticing it more and more as you start to go along and hindsight bias, hindsight bias, hindsight bias. So it's going to pop up more. You'll see it. So, errors in judging the future's foreseeability plus errors in remembering our past combine to create hindsight bias. I said that pretty fast, but let me go over it again. It says errors in the judging of future's foreseeability plus errors in remembering our past combine to create hindsight bias. If hindsight bias is persuasive, you may now be feeling like you already knew about this phenomenon. So some people out there, basically is what the book was saying, slickly, was that you may already be in that place of I knew it already. And you probably did, and some probably did, and some probably didn't. But what it's saying is that you are probably at that place to where you're saying you know it already because we're at the outcome of this demonstration. Anyway, so if hindsight bias is persuasive, you may be feeling like you already knew about this phenomenon because anything seems commonplace once explained. This is a quote from Dr. Watson to Sherlock Holmes. Consider our proverbs. So now we're going into some of the things that we just say, especially in American culture, the things that we say that, we just kind of adopt. We're going to start to examine it in our language. So we have collected a stockpile of proverbs, a few proverbs, to make almost any result seem to make sense. For example, one is, absence makes the heart grow fonder. You've heard of that one. The contrary proverb is, out of sight, out of mind. Another example is, fear is stronger than love. But then another proverb is, love is stronger than fear. I hear that too. Another proverb is, better to love and lost than to have never loved at all. And then another proverb, the contrary, is, you can't miss what you've never had. So, and there are many more. But anyway, so hindsight bias is conducive to what they say is arrogance. So hindsight bias is conducive to arrogance, an overestimation of our intellectual powers. But what seems clear in hindsight is seldom clear on the front side of history. So the things that we see now looking back as clear, as common sense, we didn't always see it that way when things were actually already happening. So I think one of the bigger examples are things that kind of go on in history. So some people may have felt that other groups in society, especially in American history, were less than others for whatever reason, etc. Maybe that was the narrative, maybe that was the whatever. But then over time, you look back and it's super silly. So there are tangible examples of that, and there are so many different other ones. Hindsight bias is conducive to arrogance and overestimation of our intellectual powers. But what seems clear in hindsight is seldom clear on the front side of history. We blame others and even ourselves for foolish decisions, for not handling a situation better. We forget that what is obvious now may not have been obvious at the time. All in all, hindsight bias is what this module is mainly about. But I don't want it to stop here without answering a question. Now, this is the actual end of this module. It's a real short module. And we talked about what hindsight bias is, but we didn't talk about, nor did the book talk about, why hindsight bias is a thing. Like, what is the purpose of hindsight bias, And that's a question that I have, and that's a question that we're going to explore right now. Now, I haven't looked into this yet because I don't want to be a victim of hindsight bias. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you my unprofessional opinion, thought on hindsight bias, on the purpose of it. So for me, whenever I think about things in terms of why things exist and stuff of that nature, when you talk about looking at humans, I go back to what I perceive in my mind is to be how we were in the early stages of humanity, suggesting that we're kind of hardwired in that way, and that the things that have gone on in that time, the ways that we were made in that time, actually make sense and live on to how we conduct ourselves now, in a sense. So one of the things that I think is the purpose for hindsight bias is I think that what it does for us, it preserves our reputation. And it also protects our perception, protects how we're perceived as a valuable member of the group. So it protects our reputation, and it preserves our importance, our position as an important member, as a valued member of the group. What I mean by that is that if, let's say you're in a situation where you are, let's go prehistoric, whatever, and you're seen as wrong, and wrong can be the difference between life and death. If I want to maintain having value to the group, I have to make sure that I'm as right as often as I can be. And so it makes more sense for me to concoct a way to where even if the answer wasn't in line with what I thought it would be, that I'm still close enough to it to be perceived as right. Because if I can sell it to myself that I'm right, then hopefully I can sell it to you as well, and you'll see that I'm right as well. And if you see that I'm right, then you'll see that I'm still a valued member of the group. Now, I could be totally wrong, but that's my guess from the forefront. What we're going to do now, hey, ChatGPT, give us the answer.
Number one, it makes us feel smarter. Saying I knew it makes us feel good, like we understand things better than we really do. Number two, it keeps things simple. Our brains like to make things easier to understand, so we pretend the answer was obvious all along. Number three, it helps us feel in control. Thinking we knew what would happen makes the world seem less random and more predictable, which feels safer. Okay, so I guess I was wrong.
All right, guys, so we looked into that. That was super fun. I hope you had a good time. This was a very short module. It was good, just kind of in and out though. Hindsight bias, module 2, did you know it all along? Thank you guys for checking out Psychology with me.